The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Atlanta Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Bennett sat quietly in the back row, her navy blue blazer and cream blouse standing in sharp contrast to the casual attire of most others who were waiting their turn. The clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m., and the courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. At 42 years old, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from years of experience in both courtrooms and boardrooms. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back in a professional bun, and her brown eyes observed everything happening around her with a focused intensity. Today, however, she wasn't here as a lawyer, a civil rights attorney, or a seasoned advocate. She was here simply as another citizen with a traffic ticket. The room smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the several police officers who moved in and out through the side door every few minutes. The main door creaked open periodically, letting in another nervous-looking person clutching their traffic citation as they filed to the front. The wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable, but Sarah sat straight, occasionally checking her phone to make sure she hadn't missed any important messages about her upcoming press conference later that day. The air was thick with a quiet tension, one she knew well, having spent years fighting against unfair treatment in the justice system. Judge William Harrison's entrance brought everyone to their feet. At 65, he was a tall, thin man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. He had been handling traffic court cases for over 20 years, and his reputation for being strict and unsympathetic was well known throughout Atlanta. As he walked into the courtroom, his steps were slow and deliberate, carrying the weariness of a man who had been in this routine for far too long. He moved with the tired routine of someone who had done this thousands of times before, his every movement marked by the monotony of the job. "Sit down," he said in a bored voice, not even looking up as he settled into his chair and began shuffling through the morning's cases. The sound of his raspy voice reverberated through the courtroom, and everyone complied, taking their seats with a mix of resignation and discomfort. Sarah watched as person after person approached the bench. Most were scared or nervous, stumbling over their words as they tried to explain their situations. The judge barely looked at them, announcing fines and dismissing their excuses with a wave of his hand. His secretary, Mrs. Thompson, typed everything into her computer with quick, sharp movements of her fingers, her eyes trained on the screen. A young man in worn work boots tried to explain that he couldn't afford his ticket because he had 3 kids to feed. "Should have thought about that before speeding," Judge Harrison said flatly, his voice void of emotion as he set the maximum fine. Sarah noted how each defendant was treated with the same indifference, each explanation met with the same cold dismissal. As the line of people slowly dwindled, Sarah's name was finally called. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked to the podium, her heels clicking softly against the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Several heads turned, perhaps noticing how different she seemed from the others who had approached the bench that morning. She walked with purpose, her expression calm but determined. Judge Harrison didn't even raise his eyes from the paper in front of him. "Mrs. Bennett, you're charged with speeding in a school zone." "How do you plead?" he asked, his voice as indifferent as his gaze. "Your Honor," Sarah began in a clear, steady voice, "I would like to present evidence that the school was closed that day for teacher training. I have documentation from the school principal, and the sign clearly states the speed limit applies only during school hours." She paused for a moment, making sure the judge had heard her, but he didn't seem to care. Judge Harrison looked up, finally showing some annoyance. His pale blue eyes barely registered her presence before he quickly turned his gaze back to his paper. "The limit applies whether children are present or not," he said dismissively, without even acknowledging the validity of her evidence. "That will be $250. Sarah felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, according to Municipal Code Section 40-206-1881, the reduced speed limit only applies during school hours and school-related activities." "I have proof of that," she said, her tone firm but respectful. The judge interrupted her again, his voice sharp with irritation. "This is not a debate club. Pay the fine or appeal." Next case. His words were final, his dismissal clear. Sarah stood there for a brief moment, taking in the scene around her. The judge's dismissive attitude, the sympathetic look from the court clerk, and the surprised expressions of the people still waiting for their turn. All of it was too familiar. But Sarah knew that the moment she was experiencing was just the beginning. Little did Judge Harrison know that in less than 8 hours, the roles would be very different, and this small moment of injustice would become part of a much larger story. Gathering her documents with deliberate care, Sarah turned and walked back down the aisle, her head held high. She had faced much worse than an arrogant judge, and today was no different. This wouldn't be the first or last time she would be dismissed or belittled, but by tomorrow the whole state would know her name, not as just another person in traffic court, but as the first black woman running for governor of Georgia. Sarah walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Atlanta sunshine, the receipt for her fine folded neatly in her hand. The frustration from the morning still lingered, but a small smile played on her lips as she thought about the press conference scheduled for 5 p.m. that evening. She checked her watch. It was just past 10 a.m., giving her plenty of time to prepare for the biggest announcement of her life. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she noticed a small group of protesters gathering near the entrance. They held signs about unfair treatment in the justice system, and Sarah slowed down to read some of the messages. One young woman's sign caught her attention. "Justice shouldn't depend on your zip code." Sarah read it again, feeling the weight of the words settle in her chest. She remembered why she had decided to run for governor in the first place. Her entire life had been shaped by the systemic inequalities she had seen and fought against, and the injustices she had experienced personally. Today, in that courtroom, she had been reminded of the importance of fighting for a fairer system, one where the law applied equally to all. Inside his chambers, Judge William Harrison sat back in his worn leather chair, taking his morning coffee break. He had handled 37 cases so far that morning, each one just another tick on his endless list of duties. As he sipped his coffee, he reviewed the cases, each one more mundane than the last. He barely noticed when his clerk, Mrs. Thompson, came in to inform him of his next case. He had already made up his mind. Another day, another round of quick judgments and dismissals. It was just another part of the routine he had long grown accustomed to, until the events of that morning, events he would not realize would come to define the course of his future. As Sarah prepared for the press conference that evening, she knew that her campaign would be shaped not only by the injustice she had faced, but also by the way it had ignited a fire in her to fight for change. What had started as a routine morning in traffic court had now become a turning point, not just for her, but for the people of Georgia. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest injustices could spark the largest movements. In just 2 hours, Judge William Harrison had set a new record for himself. He felt proud of his efficiency, his swift handling of case after case without hesitation or delay. It was what he did best, keeping the court moving, maintaining control, and ensuring the calendar was cleared by the end of the day. What he didn't realize, however, was that speed didn't always equate to justice. The last case of the morning was the one that lingered in his mind, a woman named Sarah Bennett, whose traffic ticket was anything but routine. Mrs. Thompson, his secretary, had carefully noted that Sarah had brought thorough documentation about the school being closed that day, which should have excused her from the speeding fine. But Judge Harrison waved it off with a dismissive hand, not willing to consider her evidence. "Rules are rules, Martha," he muttered, not looking up from the papers in front of him. "We can't make exceptions just because someone comes in here wearing an expensive suit and speaking like a lawyer." His tone was cold, and the words, though spoken with authority, felt wrong the moment they left his mouth. But Harrison didn't notice. He took another sip of his coffee, not seeing the faint frown tugging at Mrs. Thompson's lips, her disapproval of his attitude hidden behind the professionalism she had perfected over years of working alongside him. Meanwhile, Sarah Bennett had left the courthouse and arrived at her office at Bennett and Associates law firm, where her campaign team was waiting. The office was alive with energy as staff members rushed around preparing press releases, finalizing speech details, and checking off the last-minute to-do lists. Campaign posters were stacked in corners, still wrapped in plastic, waiting to be unveiled later that evening. It was the calm before the storm. A calm Sarah relished, despite the whirlwind of events happening around her. "How did traffic court go?" asked Michael, her campaign manager, looking up from his laptop as she entered the office. Sarah placed her purse on her desk and shared the details of the morning's events. "Well, I just got a first-hand reminder of why our justice system needs reform," she said, pulling out the traffic ticket and fine receipt. "Judge Harrison didn't even look at my evidence. He didn't even give me a chance to speak properly." Leah, the social media coordinator, perked up from her seat. "Judge Harrison? The same one who made headlines last month for giving maximum fines to all those protesters." "The very same," Sarah replied, sitting down at her desk. She opened her laptop and began reviewing her announcement speech one last time. She felt a sense of urgency now, as though the morning's experience had given her new material to work with. It wasn't just the injustice she'd faced that morning that fueled her. It was the knowledge that this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A system that didn't listen to its people. A system that, for too long, had silenced the voices of the marginalized. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison was preparing for his afternoon session. He flipped through his calendar and noticed that he had been invited to that evening's political fundraiser at City Hall. Several of his judicial colleagues had mentioned that a big announcement was planned, but Harrison hadn't paid much attention to the details. Politics wasn't really his concern. He preferred the simple black and white nature of traffic violations, their straightforwardness, the clarity of judgment. No ambiguity, no emotion. He could hand out fines and dismiss cases with a level of precision that satisfied his need for control. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's office became increasingly busy. Her phone kept ringing with calls from supporters and media outlets who had caught wind of her upcoming announcement. Her staff had prepared her favorite navy blue suit for the evening, and her speech cards were printed on crisp, white paper, each word carefully selected. Michael stuck his head into her office. "CNN, Fox, local stations, they'll all be there. Are you ready to make history?" Sarah stood up and walked to her office window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline as the afternoon sun bathed the city in golden light. Her thoughts drifted back to her morning in traffic court, the faces of the people who had been dismissed and disrespected, their voices ignored by the very system that was supposed to serve them. She thought about her 20 years as a civil rights attorney, about her parents who had marched for voting rights, about her daughter who deserved to grow up in a better Georgia. "You know, Michael," she said, turning back to face him, "that traffic court session this morning was a gift. It reminded me exactly why we're doing this. Judge Harrison probably thinks he'll never see me again." She smiled as she picked up her speech cards. "I wonder what he'll think when he sees me on the evening news." As Sarah gathered her team for final preparations, the energy in her office surged. She could feel the weight of the moment upon her, the anticipation building. She was about to take the first step toward the biggest change Georgia had seen in years. In just a few hours, Judge Harrison would learn that the woman he had dismissed so easily in his courtroom was about to become the most talked-about person in Georgia. The photo of Sarah that would appear on tomorrow's front pages had already been selected. She looked confident, determined, and every bit the governor she aimed to become. The City Hall ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and polished glasses as Atlanta's most influential people gathered for the evening's political fundraiser. The buzz of conversation filled the room, but Judge William Harrison stood near the buffet table, holding a glass of water and making small talk with other judges. He felt comfortable here, among people who respected his position and authority. This was his element, the familiar world of legal circles, a world where everyone knew their place. "You might want to watch this, Bill," said Judge Mary Peterson, nodding toward the large TV screens mounted on the walls. Harrison, uninterested in the political drama unfolding, checked his watch. It was 7:30 p.m. He had already handled 63 cases that day and was thinking more about getting home to relax and watch his favorite crime show than about any political news. He was a man of routine, efficient, controlled, and completely detached from the world of political spectacles. But the room grew quiet as the TV screens switched to a live broadcast from the steps of the state capitol. The Golden Dome glowed in the evening light, and a crowd had gathered, their signs faintly visible in the background. A row of American and Georgia state flags fluttered in the breeze. "Ladies and gentlemen," a tall man in a gray suit announced, "please welcome Sarah Bennett." Harrison nearly choked on his water. His eyes widened in disbelief. There she was, the same woman from his traffic court that morning. She walked confidently to the podium, now wearing a different suit, but her presence was unmistakable. "Good evening, fellow Georgians." Sarah's voice rang clear through the TV speakers. The ballroom fell into complete silence. "My name is Sarah Bennett, and today I am announcing my candidacy for governor of Georgia." The glass in Harrison's hand began to shake slightly. He looked around, his colleagues whispering and pointing at him. They knew he had presided over the traffic court that morning. His collar suddenly felt too tight, and he shifted uncomfortably, his mind struggling to process what was unfolding on the screen. The camera zoomed in on Sarah as she held up a familiar piece of paper. A traffic fine receipt from that morning. The same one he had signed without a second thought. "Today, like many days in my life," she continued, "I experienced firsthand why our state needs change. This morning, I sat in a traffic court where justice was rushed, voices were silenced, and dignity was denied. Not just to me, but to everyday, hard-working Georgians." Judge Peterson turned to Harrison, her raised eyebrows questioning him. "Isn't that your court she's talking about?" Bill Harrison couldn't answer. He was paralyzed, his thoughts scattered. All he could do was watch as the woman he had so easily dismissed earlier that day took center stage, challenging not just him, but the very system he had helped uphold for years. The realization hit him hard. In that moment, his routine of efficiency had cost him something far more important than a quick judgment. "Second thought," Sarah continued, her voice unwavering as she looked out over the gathered crowd and cameras. "This receipt represents more than just a traffic fine." She held the paper aloft, her expression one of quiet but fierce conviction. "It represents a system that needs reform. A system where some judges don't even look at evidence before making decisions, where the color of your skin, the cost of your clothes, or the manner in which you speak might influence your treatment." The ballroom erupted in murmurs, a wave of tension spreading through the room. The cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes, and Harrison's stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of his position pressing on him, the recognition that everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was being dismantled before him. He watched as pictures flashed on the screens behind Sarah. Her Harvard law diploma, images of her arguing landmark civil rights cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, photos from her work with civil rights organizations. The room was filled with gasps and whispers. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was a formidable force, someone whose name had carried weight long before today's announcement. She had been a state senator for 6 years. She had won landmark cases. Last year, she received the prestigious State Bar Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, and he had dismissed her with a wave of his hand, barely glancing at her, barely noticing the weight of her words or the significance of her presence. A reporter appeared beside him, microphone in hand, and Harrison felt a cold sweat form on his brow. "Your Honor," the reporter asked, "do you have any comment on Sarah Bennett's announcement or what happened in your courtroom this morning?" Harrison's throat went dry, and he stumbled backward, almost bumping into the buffet table. More reporters were approaching now, their cameras flashing relentlessly. He could hear Sarah's voice still ringing clear through the television screens, her words cutting through the tension. "We need leaders who listen," she said. "Leaders who look people in the eye. Leaders who believe that every Georgian deserves respect and fair treatment." Whether they're in a courtroom, a classroom, or a boardroom, the judge's head spun slightly. He felt dizzy, a realization creeping into his consciousness. His phone began to buzz with a flurry of messages from colleagues, family members, and friends who had seen the broadcast. In just 12 hours, he had gone from being a respected judge, a man whose judgments were considered beyond reproach, to becoming an example of everything that was wrong with the judicial system. He needed to escape. He rushed toward the exit, trying to avoid the cameras and questions, but it was no use. The reporters followed him, their questions coming faster and more insistently. As he walked through the door, He heard Sarah's final words echoing in his mind. Together, we can build a Georgia where justice isn't just a word on a courthouse wall, but a reality for every citizen. Every day, in every courtroom, the evening air felt cool on his face, but Harrison's world had already turned hot with embarrassment and realization. His thoughts were jumbled, his mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. Tomorrow's newspapers would tell the story, and his name would be forever linked to the launch of Sarah Bennett's historic campaign for governor. That night, Judge William Harrison sat alone in his dark living room. The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m., and the television was still on, muted, but the images continued to flicker across the screen. Over and over again, the footage of Sarah Bennett's announcement played, mixed with clips from the courthouse's security cameras. Footage that showed Harrison's dismissive behavior toward her earlier that day. The realization of how he had treated her settled heavily in his stomach. His phone had finally stopped ringing, but the silence in his home felt oppressive. There were 37 missed calls, over 50 text messages, and even his own daughter had sent him a message that made his heart heavy. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened today." Harrison sat motionless for several moments, the weight of it all bearing down on him. His mind raced, but his body felt frozen in place. He had been so focused on efficiency, on maintaining control over his courtroom, that he had failed to see the humanity of those who stood before him. He had never taken the time to look at them, to listen to their stories. He slowly got up from the couch and walked to his home office. The small desk lamp flickered on, casting a soft yellow light over the walls that were covered in awards and certificates. Judge of the Year 2019, Excellence in Judicial Service, 20 years on the bench. These titles, once symbols of pride and accomplishment, now felt hollow in his hands. He opened his laptop for the first time that night and began researching the people who had appeared in his court earlier that day. What he found made his stomach turn. He read about the young man in work boots whom he had fined heavily that morning. A single father working 3 jobs to support his children after his wife had died of cancer. Harrison remembered dismissing the man's plea, his request for leniency because he couldn't afford the fine. He had been too focused on his numbers, his efficiency, to see the struggle in that father's eyes. Next, he read about the elderly woman who had been late to court. She had taken 3 buses to get there because her car had broken down. Harrison had added an extra fine for her tardiness without once asking why she had been late, without considering the hardships she had faced just to make it to court. And then, there was Sarah Bennett. Harrison's hands shook as he read her biography online. Harvard Law School. Graduated at the top of her class. Worked on 5 major civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. Started a free legal clinic for low-income families. A state senator who had written groundbreaking bills on judicial reform. The first black woman to serve as president of the State Bar Association. Harrison sank deeper into his chair, the weight of his ignorance pressing on him. "Oh God," he whispered to himself, as the full scope of his mistake hit him. He had been so caught up in his role, in his judgments, that he hadn't even bothered to look at her face, to recognize the gravity of her work or the depth of her experience. The security camera footage from his courtroom played again on the news, and Harrison really watched, for the first time. He saw himself, the cold, dismissive tone, the way he cut people off mid-sentence, the way he never bothered to listen. His wife, Susan, entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She had been unusually quiet all evening, which was unlike her. Setting 1 cup on his desk, she sat down across from him. "Well," she said softly, using his first name as she always did in serious moments, "do you remember why you became a judge?" Harrison stared into his tea, the steam rising in gentle swirls. Of course, he remembered. 30 years ago, he had stood before a judge as a young lawyer, watching that judge listen carefully to every person, treating each case as if it were the most important one of the day. That judge had inspired him to leave his law practice and pursue a position on the bench. He had wanted to be that kind of judge, the kind who treated everyone with respect, who saw the person behind the case. "When did I become this person?" he asked, more to himself than to his wife. "When did I stop seeing the people in front of me?" Susan reached across the desk and touched his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "It didn't happen all at once," she said. "It happened so slowly that you didn't notice. Like a tree growing, you don't see it getting bigger day by day." Harrison opened his court schedule for the next day. 28 cases, 28 people, 28 stories. He would have normally rushed through them without a second thought. But now, for the first time, he saw them, each individual, each case deserving of his full attention. He picked up his phone and called his clerk, Mrs. Thompson, even though it was almost midnight. "Martha, I'm sorry to call so late," he said when she answered. "Could you do something for me tomorrow? Could you pull the full background files for every case? And could you space the schedule out? Give each person 15 minutes instead of 5. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Mrs. Thompson's voice, warm and filled with understanding, replied, "Of course, Your Honor. I've been waiting 15 years for you to ask that." After hanging up, Harrison walked to his bedroom window. The Atlanta skyline glittered in the distance, the lights twinkling like stars. Somewhere out there, Sarah Bennett was probably still awake, too, planning her campaign, preparing to change Georgia. And without meaning to, she had already changed him. At least one person had changed. A 65-year-old judge who had forgotten what justice really meant. Tomorrow would be different, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would look each person in the eye. Tomorrow he would listen. Tomorrow he would remember why he became a judge in the first place. 3 months had passed since Sarah Bennett's dramatic announcement, and the summer heat of Georgia was relentless, pressing down on the crowd gathered outside a small community center in Savannah. Sarah stood on a makeshift stage, sweat beading on her forehead, but her voice remained strong despite the fact that she had already given 4 speeches that day. "When I walked into that courtroom this morning," she told the crowd, wiping the sweat from her brow, "I wasn't a state senator. I wasn't a Harvard graduate. I was just another face the system didn't want to see." The crowd nodded in agreement, many of them holding signs with the campaign slogan, "Justice for all Georgians." At the back of the crowd, a local reporter named Tom Chun stood, watching intently as Sarah spoke. He had been following her campaign for weeks, captivated by the way she connected with both rural and urban voters. His notebook was filled with stories of people driving for hours just to hear her speak. Her words were resonating across Georgia. During the question period, a young mother raised her hand, her voice nervous but determined. "Miss Bennett, my son got a ticket last month. The judge wouldn't even look at him. How will you change things like this?" Sarah smiled softly, remembering her own painful experience in the courtroom. "Change starts with awareness," she replied, her voice steady. Since that day in Judge Harrison's court, over 50 judges across Georgia have signed up for our new training program. And you know what? Judge Harrison himself was the first to sign up. The crowd buzzed with surprise. No one had expected that twist in the story. Sarah had taken the moment to highlight the change she was calling for, but it was her ability to showcase the personal transformations, like Harrison's, that made the crowd believe in the possibility of real reform. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Judge Harrison was doing something he had never done before. For the first time in his career, he sat in the jury box of his empty courtroom during lunch, watching recordings of his own morning sessions. Next to him sat Dr. Maria Rodriguez, an expert in judicial bias training, who pointed out subtle but powerful behaviors he had never noticed before. "See how you leaned back when that woman in the hijab approached the bench?" Dr. Rodriguez observed. "And you leaned forward when the man in the business suit spoke. These are unconscious signals we send." Harrison nodded, taking notes, feeling a mix of embarrassment and resolve. His calendar had changed. He now scheduled fewer cases each day, creating more time to listen to the people in his court. His clerk, Mrs. Thompson, had noticed the difference. The people who left his courtroom seemed different now, more respected, more heard. Even those who were fined left with a sense that they had been treated fairly, that they had been seen. Back in Savannah, Sarah's campaign event was drawing to a close. People lined up to shake her hand, many sharing their own courthouse stories. An elderly man stepped forward, showing her a ticket from Judge Harrison's court. "He listened to my whole story," the man said, his eyes bright with surprise. Asked about my grandkids and everything, then he reduced my fine because I'm on a fixed income. Never had a judge treat me like that before. Sarah smiled, her heart warmed by the story. She remembered the calls she had received from other judges when Harrison had begun his reform program. Sometimes, she told her campaign manager later that evening, the biggest changes start in the smallest courtrooms. That night, in hotels across Georgia, both Sarah and Judge Harrison prepared for the next day's events. Sarah reviewed her speech for tomorrow's rally in Augusta, adding new notes about the stories she had heard that day. Her phone kept buzzing with updates on polling numbers. She was now leading in several counties. In his hotel room in Atlanta, Harrison sat down to review the files for tomorrow's cases. Each file now included not just the violation, but notes about the person behind the ticket. His new policy required his clerk to gather background information whenever possible, not to change his decisions, but to help him understand the lives behind the violations. Suddenly, both of their phones flashed with a breaking news alert. Georgia Judicial Council announces new bias training requirement for all state judges. Bennett case cited as catalyst for change. Sarah read the news in her hotel room and paused for a moment, reflecting on how it had all unfolded. She hadn't planned for any of this to happen in this way. She had just wanted to fight an unfair ticket, to make a stand for herself. But sometimes, the most significant moments in life come from the smallest of injustices. She thought about the many people she had met along the way, the stories of personal struggles that had connected her to the people of Georgia. In his hotel room, Judge Harrison read the same news alert. He thought about how one morning, one case, and one mistake had led to the biggest change in his 30-year career. Harrison had come to realize that his actions that day had not just affected Sarah Bennett, but had sparked a shift that was sweeping through the entire state's judicial system. He picked up his phone and did something he had been wanting to do for months. He typed out a message to Sarah Bennett. Thank you for helping me become a better judge. Georgia will be lucky to have you as governor. Sarah received the message just as she was getting ready for bed. She smiled softly, thinking about how sometimes the best changes don't come from fighting against people, but from helping them find their better selves. 5 months later, the main conference room at the Atlanta Judicial Center was packed with reporters, cameras flashing from every angle. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 5 months after the traffic court incident that had changed everything. Judge William Harrison stood behind the podium, adjusting his tie nervously. He had never called a press conference before in his life. Sitting in the front row was his wife, Susan, offering him an encouraging smile. Next to her sat Mrs. Thompson, his clerk, holding a thick folder filled with court statistics from the past 5 months. The room buzzed with whispered conversations and the click of cameras. "Good morning," Harrison began, his voice slightly shaky. "5 months ago, I made a mistake that opened my eyes. Today, I want to talk about that mistake, and more importantly, about what I've learned since then." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned forward, their pens ready. Everyone knew this was about the Sarah Bennett incident, but no one expected what came next. For 30 years, Harrison continued, pulling out his reading glasses, "I've sat on this bench. I've handled over 100,000 cases, and I've been wrong more times than I can count." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "Not wrong about the law, but wrong about the people I was serving." He took a deep breath before continuing. "The truth is, I've spent too many years judging cases and not enough time listening to the people behind those cases. I've made assumptions based on appearances, and I've failed to see the humanity of the people before me." A murmur ran through the room as Harrison continued. He spoke about the changes he had made in his courtroom, how he now took the time to listen, to understand the context behind each case. He discussed the new bias training program for judges and how it was already having a positive impact. "I have learned a lot," Harrison concluded, his voice steady now, "and I hope that as we move forward, we can create a judicial system that truly serves the people of Georgia, with fairness, dignity, and respect." The reporters in the room were silent for a moment, processing what they had just heard. For the first time, Harrison had shown the world not just his authority as a judge, but his vulnerability, and his commitment to change. It was a pivotal moment, one that would go down in history as the day a judge who had once been part of the problem became part of the solution. Judge William Harrison stood at the podium, his hands shaking as he prepared to speak. The room at the Judicial Center was packed with reporters, all eager to hear from the man who had, just months before, made a public apology for his actions in court. Harrison wasn't a man who had ever been used to the spotlight, but today, he was standing before it, about to share the steps he had taken to transform not only his courtroom but his approach to justice. The news had spread quickly, and Sarah Bennett's campaign had become an unexpected catalyst for change. As Harrison began speaking, his voice faltered slightly, but he steadied himself. 5 months ago, he began, his voice steadying with each word. I made a mistake that opened my eyes, and I want to talk about that mistake, about what I've learned from it. I have spent my career in this courtroom, making decisions, handing down judgments, and moving cases through as quickly as possible. But in my rush for efficiency, I overlooked something crucial. I overlooked the people in front of me. Harrison paused, and the weight of his words hung in the air. He could feel the eyes of every reporter, every camera, trained on him. This was no ordinary press conference. It wasn't a speech to defend his actions or deflect blame. This was about accountability, about admitting where he had gone wrong and sharing what he had done to make it right. His gaze shifted down to the papers in front of him. These, he said, holding up a stack of letters, are letters from people who appeared in my court over the years. People I rushed through, people whose stories I never took the time to hear. Because I was too busy trying to be efficient instead of being fair. He flipped through the pages and the weight of his admissions grew. I didn't give them time to explain. I didn't see them as individuals, just cases to be processed. And that's not justice. The room was silent as he read aloud from one of the letters. Dear Judge Harrison, I tried to tell you about my sick daughter that day, about how I was speeding because she needed her medicine. But you didn't give me time to explain. His voice cracked slightly, and he took a deep breath, wiping his glasses before continuing. That's the moment that changed everything for me. It wasn't just about the law. It was about seeing the people in front of me as human beings, not numbers on a docket. Harrison paused again, collecting himself. The day Sarah Bennett stood in my courtroom, I didn't know she was running for governor. But that shouldn't matter. Every person who stands before a judge deserves the same respect, the same attention. Whether they're a future governor or a grocery store clerk, they all deserve to be treated with dignity. He set the letter down, and the room was still, the reporters absorbing his words. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, he took out a set of statistics. Since that day, we've made changes, he said. Every person now gets at least 15 minutes in court, not just 5. We ask about their circumstances before setting fines. We've started a payment plan program for those who can't pay all at once. He glanced up at the cameras. And most importantly, I've learned to look people in the eye when they speak to me. In the back of the room, Sarah Bennett, sitting with her campaign staff, watched the press conference intently. The transformation in Judge Harrison's approach was more than she had ever imagined when she first challenged his handling of her traffic ticket. She hadn't expected her fight for justice to lead to this, but now it was clear how much had changed. His actions weren't just reshaping his own courtroom. They were inspiring a movement across Georgia. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages of congratulations and inquiries from the press, but she stayed focused on the screen. Judge Harrison's words resonated deeply. He wasn't just talking about policy changes. He was offering a public apology for the way he had treated people. For once, a judge wasn't just upholding the law. He was also recognizing the human cost of his decisions. Today, Harrison said, his voice growing stronger, I'm launching a free training program for judges across Georgia. We're calling it Justice Sees, because justice isn't just about following the law. It's about seeing the people those laws affect. The reporters were silent for a moment, taken aback by the honesty in his words. This was not the typical rhetoric they were used to hearing from those in positions of power. Harrison was acknowledging the flaws in the system, not hiding behind the status quo. He was challenging his fellow judges to do the same. As Sarah watched, She knew this wasn't just about her or Judge Harrison anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about how a small moment of injustice could, if handled with the right kind of leadership, lead to something transformative. Sarah had set out to change a broken system, and now she was seeing firsthand how it could be done. When Harrison finished his speech, he did something that no one had expected. He stepped away from the podium and walked to the judge's bench in the corner of the room. "Now," he said, looking directly at the cameras, "I'd like to hear your stories. And this time I promise to listen." The reporters exchanged glances, surprised by this unexpected turn. Then, one by one, they began to speak, sharing their own thoughts on the changes they had witnessed. Harrison leaned forward, made eye contact with each person who spoke, and did what he had never done before. He listened. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just a judge handing down decisions. He was a person, connecting with others, truly hearing them. The following months saw more change. In the courtroom, things were different. When Sarah Bennett visited the courthouse in Atlanta 7 months later, it was a completely transformed environment. No longer did the people in the courtroom feel rushed or ignored. Gone were the long lines of frustrated individuals. Comfortable chairs had replaced the old wooden benches, and a digital screen displayed each person's waiting time. Most surprisingly, there was now a small play area for children whose parents had court appointments, making the experience less stressful for families. Sarah quietly sat in the back row of courtroom 4B, watching Judge Harrison at work. A young woman approached the bench, looking nervous. "Good morning, Ms. Rodriguez," Harrison said warmly, his smile genuine. "I see you're here about a parking ticket, but first, how is your nursing school going?" The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected such a personal question. "You remembered?" she asked. "Of course," Harrison replied. "You mentioned it last month when we set up your payment plan. Tell me, how's it going?" For the next 10 minutes, Harrison spoke with the woman about her studies, her part-time job, and the struggles she was facing. At the end of their conversation, Harrison worked out a new payment schedule that fit her student budget. The young woman left the courtroom smiling, something that Sarah hadn't seen in months. Later, during the lunch break, other judges from across Georgia gathered in the courthouse's main conference room. They were there for the Justice Seas training program that Judge Harrison had launched. Sarah slipped into the back of the room to observe. Harrison stood at the front, but instead of standing behind a podium, he sat casually on the edge of a desk. Behind him, statistics told an amazing story. Complaint rates in his court were down by 85%, payment completion rates were up by 60%, and return offender rates had dropped by 70%. Public satisfaction was at an all-time high. One older judge raised his hand. "But we'll never get through our caseload if we spend so much time with each person," he said. Harrison smiled and pulled up more numbers. "Actually, we're handling the same number of cases. We just reorganized our time. No more rushed mornings, no more afternoon backlogs. And here's the interesting part. When people feel heard, their cases actually take less time overall." In the back of the room, Sarah made notes on her phone. Her campaign had already promised judicial reform across Georgia, but seeing these results in action gave her new ideas. This wasn't just about making courts fairer, it was about making them work better for everyone. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the courthouse's new Family Resource Center, another of Harrison's ideas. The center provided people with help understanding their tickets, setting up payment plans, and finding legal aid. It was clear that the changes were not only improving the experience for the people in the courtroom, but also making the entire system more efficient. As Sarah watched the transformation unfold before her, she realized that sometimes real change begins with a single act of listening, and the willingness to see people as they truly are. Judge William Harrison's clerk spent her afternoons helping people navigate the complexities of the court system, offering support to those struggling to understand the intricacies of fines, payment plans, and legal aid. It was a new chapter for the court system, one that was drastically different from the rush and impersonal nature of the past. Judge Harrison himself would come in every Friday afternoon to join his clerk, not in his robes or behind the bench, but simply to talk with the people who came before him. It wasn't about authority or judgment, it was about connection. No robes, No bench, just conversations, Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, had explained to Sarah Bennett when she visited the courthouse to see how things had changed. Can you believe this is the same man from 7 months ago? It was hard to believe. The judge who had once rushed through cases with little thought for the people in front of him was now engaging in meaningful dialogues with those who had business in his court. And it wasn't just the individuals. This new approach had sparked a wider change across the entire state. When Sarah walked outside the courthouse that afternoon, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction that she hadn't experienced in a long time. TV crews were already setting up for the evening news, eager to cover the story of how a seemingly simple traffic ticket had sparked a revolution in Georgia's justice system. The cameras weren't just focused on Sarah or even on Judge Harrison. They were focused on the larger narrative of change, and how it all began with one small act of injustice handled with grace and compassion. Judge Harrison emerged from the courthouse, briefcase in hand, and spotted Sarah standing just outside. He walked over with a smile. "Never thought you'd be back here voluntarily," he said with a small chuckle. "Never thought I'd say this," Sarah replied with a laugh of her own, "but I'm glad I got that ticket." They both stood there for a moment, gazing at the courthouse. The old stone walls glowed in the late afternoon sun, and above the door were the words, "Equal justice under law," a motto that now, more than ever, felt like it had been truly earned. Sarah glanced at Harrison. For the first time in many years, both of them felt that those words were becoming a reality. Harrison said quietly, "Some people think the biggest changes have to start with big actions. But sometimes," he paused, and Sarah finished his sentence for him. "They start with a simple traffic ticket and a judge who learns to listen." Behind them, the courthouse doors opened, and another group of judges arrived for the evening's training session. Change was happening, and it wasn't limited to one courtroom or one judge. It was happening one case at a time, one story at a time, and all of it had started because a judge who didn't look up one morning had finally learned to see the people standing before him. A year had passed since that fateful morning in traffic court. Now, the Georgia State Capitol building stood bathed in the warm light of the early morning sun, as crowds began gathering for the inauguration of the new governor. News crews from all over the country were setting up their cameras, eager to capture this historic moment. Sarah Bennett stood in a small office, looking out the window at the growing crowd. Dressed in a deep blue suit, she adjusted her mother's pearl necklace, which caught the light as she took a deep breath. In her hand, she held 2 items, her inauguration speech and, surprisingly, that old traffic court fine receipt, the one that had started everything. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Michael, her campaign manager, now her chief of staff. "Ready, Governor Bennett?" he asked, still getting used to the new title. "There's someone here who wants to see you before the ceremony," he added. Judge William Harrison stepped into the room, looking different from that first morning a year ago. His smile was warm as he carried a small, wrapped package. "I thought you might want this for your new office," he said, handing her the package. Sarah carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a framed photo. One photo showed the scene from that morning in traffic court, a moment that had sparked everything. Next to it was a photo of Harrison's completely transformed courtroom, a model of how courts across the country could be reformed. "From worst moment to best moment," Harrison said softly. "Who would have thought?" Sarah placed the frame carefully on a nearby table. She smiled as she looked at the photos, the journey of the last year reflected in those images. She said thoughtfully, "When I walked into your courtroom that morning, I was so angry about that unfair ticket. I had no idea it would lead to all this." Through the window, they could see more people arriving, holding signs that read "Justice is listening and change starts in our courts," slogans that had grown from their story. But Sarah knew that the biggest change wasn't in the signs or slogans. It was in the numbers. Over 200 Georgia judges had completed the Justice Sees training program, and the results spoke for themselves. Complaint rates in courts across the state had dropped by 50%. Public trust in the judicial system had reached its highest level in 30 years. And the program was now being copied by 5 other states. "5 minutes until we need you outside," Michael reminded them, bringing Sarah back to the present. She turned to Harrison. "Would you like to walk out with me?" she asked. After all, this victory belongs to both of us. Harrison smiled and shook his head. This is your moment. But I'll be in the front row, doing what I've learned to do best this past year. Listening. As Sarah walked toward the door, Harrison called out one last time, "Governor Bennett, that traffic ticket? I still think you were speeding." They both laughed, remembering just how far they had come from that very moment. Outside, the crowd cheered as Sarah Bennett appeared at the top of the Capitol steps. The old Georgia sun shone down on the faces of people from all walks of life, of all ages and backgrounds. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat with his wife, Shusin, and Mrs. Thompson. Behind them were faces Sarah recognized from that first morning in traffic court: the young nursing student, the single father, the elderly woman who had taken 3 buses to make it to court. All of them here to witness history. As Sarah raised her right hand to take the oath of office, she saw Judge Harrison lean forward slightly. He made eye contact with her, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent connection. Just as he had learned to do in the past year, he was listening. It wasn't just about becoming governor. It was about how one small moment of injustice, handled with grace and determination, could change not just 2 people but an entire state. After the ceremony, as people celebrated and cameras flashed, Sarah returned to her new office. She carefully hung the framed photo from Harrison on the wall. Those 2 images, the cold morning in traffic court and the transformed courtroom. They would remind her, and everyone who visited, that the biggest changes often begin with the smallest moments. Later that evening, as the sun set on her first day as governor, Sarah sat at her new desk, reflecting on everything that had led her here. She picked up the old traffic ticket one last time and, unexpectedly, framed it as well. She hung it right next to her law degree, and beneath it, she placed a small plaque with words that would define her administration. Justice begins with one person deciding to listen. Across town, in his courtroom, Judge Harrison was finishing his day too. As he prepared to leave, he looked up at the words carved above his bench. He smiled, turned off the lights, and walked out, ready to return the next day and listen to more stories. One case at a time, one person at a time, change was happening, and its impact had only just begun.